Bakes and Cookies and Pie Lab. And if you are an attention person, you like making things beautiful, then baking is going to be for you. If you're not, then baking probably isn't for you, because it is some attention to detail, and when you don't follow the rules, things are not going to turn out. So when we're talking about cakes, if you want to be a baker and you want to do a variety of cakes, you better have a lot of room in your kitchen to store all the different cake pans. I'll talk about that in a minute. But in the basics of cakes, you want to work with cake flour because it's very fine, and it'll allow for some nice texture and some height when it's leavening. It's important that we sift the flour as it settles. And with our moisture, you want to fluff it up so you don't add too much flour. If you add too much flour to a cake, it ends up flat and dense and not very, very pretty. So it's important to sift it, then we measure it. So you sift it in a bowl. This is a sifter. If you don't have one, you can use a colander and just kind of shake it through. But basically, we're fluffing and making it lighter so that we get less, not more, of the flour. So cake flour is very important, but you can use AP flour, all-purpose flour, for some cakes that you want to be a little more dense, especially your brownies and things like that are allowed to use all-purpose. You don't want a lot of height with those. The first step of making a cake is you cream the fat with the sugar, and that is very important. You start with that. You always start with that. Then you start adding the eggs, one at a time. You separate the liquid, which is usually milk, with the flour and the leavening agent, which is going to be your baking powder, because it has the acid and the base in it. And you can also sift that into the flour if you want to. And then we start alternating liquids with the flour until we get a nice uniform. We scrape a lot. We use a mixer when we can, because most of us don't have the arm strength to do it by hand. We scrape a lot to make sure there's uniformity in the batter. And then we put it in whatever pan we want. The darker the pans, the better. This is a mini bundt cake. Right now, bundt cakes are kind of popular along with cupcakes. The bundt cakes are kind of tricky because they're little grooves, and you want to get this out. When we cool it, we turn it upside down, and if you don't grease and flour really well in the inside here, you'll end up finding that most of your cake stays in the pan, the other ends up on the plate, and you're not going to get a pretty product. So there is some technique in doing that. The same would happen with this little miniature bundt cake. Cake pans can be round or square, depending on whether you're doing a shortened cake. We want it sturdy enough so we can put icing, frosting in between the layers, and on top that's traditional wedding cake, a birthday cake, or we can just do a flat 13 by 9 pan. This would just be a cake that we would cut. It wouldn't be what we call a layered cake. And when you want to do a multi-layer, we actually take dental floss and we cut the cake in half, each one of these, if we made 2, so that we make a layer of 4, and then we can put layers in between those to make a 4-layer cake, or an 8-layer, or how many ever you want to do. For the unshortened cake, like an angel food cake, you need an angel food cake pan. This is an angel food cake pan. It's different than a bundt cake. It's a little wider here. We don't use any fat in this. It's a lot of egg white, not a lot of calories. We used to use it, angel food cake, as a dessert in hospitals for diabetics. When we cool it, we put it upside down on a bottle and let it cool, and then very, very trickily kind of ease the edges and out in one piece. So it is kind of tricky. Other version, and then we want to cool on a cooling rack. We don't normally have our cakes warm unless you're eating a molten lava cake. Most of the times they're going to be cooled, so you can put the icing, which are usually fat-based. You don't want them hot, otherwise the icing just melts and it becomes a big old mess. Brownies and cake mixes. I'm a fan of cake mixes, but I'm going to add my own little love to it, because where they try to cut cost in these products is usually in the quality of the vanilla. So I'm always going to add extra vanilla to it. I might add more cocoa powder to this one to give it a more chocolatey flavor. I can add espresso powder if I want a coffee chocolate taste. But I'm always going to add a little bit more. I like adding puddings to cake mixes. It makes them much moister. You can add sour cream, yogurt, other things to make them moist, applesauce. I do like a moist cake, and it helps these. And then when we're talking about cookies, cookies are done similar to a cake. We're going to do the sugar and the fat first. Then we're going to add the eggs and then the flour and then whatever else we're adding, whether it's chocolate chip. We almost always use all-purpose flour for cookies because we don't really need a lot of height. Frozen cookie dough and refrigerated cookie dough and these kind of cookie doughs are actually fairly tricky, and peanut butter cookies are very tricky because they burn very quickly. So when we put them on the pan, I like to use parchment paper so they come off the pan. And then you just want to put them in the oven until they just look a little undone in the middle of the cookie, and they're going to crisp up. If you leave it on the pan, the heat from the pan will continue to cook it till it becomes the perfect cookie, which is crunchy on the outside, a little bit gooey and soft in the inside. As I mentioned, peanut butter cookies, because peanut butter is so high in fat, are harder to cook, and we tend to overcook them, making them hard, crunchy. You noticed in the lab that we did a variety of different kinds of manipulations to the traditional cupcake, playing with the sugars, playing with the fats, and you could see how the fats we could get away with some of the issues, but when it came to the sugars, it was really hard. Those alternative baking mixes, the trivia one with stevia really did not work. There was a bad aftertaste. But the one using Splenda, which is a corn-based sugar, actually worked. It works out okay. So if you're a brittle diabetic or somebody who really needs to get your blood sugar under control and you still want some sweets, I would use Splenda as a baking mix. For the vegans, the products, we're not that bad. You're going to have to, because we're taking away what we need in a recipe to make a good cake. So the eggs are being replaced by something. The sugar was being replaced with a raw sugar, or this was coconut sugar, which is brown. It has a lot of fiber in it. So it didn't rise very high. The eggs weren't there to help with the leavening. But it wasn't a terrible product. It's just going to be different. You're just going to have to sell it to somebody as something different, not necessarily a traditional cupcake. So some other pans that you might be interested in purchasing for if you're making cheesecakes, you need a springform pan. You can also use springform pans to make some other things, but it allows you to pull and the cheesecake would be on top of that, and this is how you would serve it and cut it. It's a very dense dessert, so you want a kind of a sturdy pan to hold it up. We used to steam back in the time of Dickens. We used to steam our cakes, and this is an example of a steamed caker. It was a dense cake with a lot of fruits and in it maybe some suet, which is fat from an animal. They mixed all together. They weren't terribly sweet, and then they would steam them in water, and then they were done. If you're a fan of A Christmas Carol, then you know that was the big excitement of Christmas, was that. We also have a flan pan where we would put our caramelized sugars at the bottom and then put your flan, which is an egg-based dessert, flip the pan, and hopefully it comes out all nice and beautiful. Again, there's a lot of technique in baking. There are a lot of opportunities to talk to people about sweeteners, and people want to know about them because they're confused. There's so many choices. I try not to say anything bad about any one sweetener. It's very individual. It's what's going on in your body. If you're having problems controlling your blood sugar, then you're going to want to reduce the amount of sugars. The average American eats about 100 pounds of sugar a year, and most of us aren't going to the store and buying 20-pound bags of sugar. So where are we getting this sugar? Mostly it's from beverages. So if we can switch to something that's less sugary and untrain our taste buds into liking so much sweet, then that can help. But the food industry really isn't helping us very well. When I'm talking about sugars, I like to talk about the color of the packets. So I have examples of the different packets. Saccharin is the oldest. If you're working with seniors, this is the one they grew up eating. It's a man-made product, causes cancer in laboratory animals when consumed in mega amounts. You can't eat this in mega amounts. They don't even put it in soda anymore like they did in the 60s and the 70s. And then we have Equal, which was made in the 80s. It's 2 amino acids that a man accidentally put together. It ended up being sweet because amino acids aren't sweet. Made it into an artificial sweetener. Then Splenda came out. This is the baking mix. It's usually a yellow packet. It's the problem with Equal is you can't bake with it because it's amino acid. When you heat it, it denatures the amino acids, and they're not sweet anymore. So they came up with Splenda, which is a corn-based product. The molecule's a little arranged differently. The body doesn't identify it, so it doesn't use it and absorb it as a carbohydrate source. But you can bake with it, as we know from the lab. It came out with a really good product. And then stevia is fairly new. Came out in the 2000s. It's a plant. It's fairly sweet. For some people, it has a very bad aftertaste. So it's individual based on what kind of tongue you inherited. The stevia baking mix, people do not like it because at first, when you first take a bite of it in a product, it's like, oh, this is good. It's sweet. And then the minute you swallow it, then you taste all the what we call bitterness of it. They also have some raw sugar stevia blends, so maybe that will cut some of that out. Nectrice is out, which is from monk fruit. It's also a fruit that's naturally sweet that has been made into an artificial sweetener. What about honey, molasses? So originally when we take cane sugar and we break it down, it's made into what we call pure cane syrup. And some of your older ethnic groups from the South are used to eat this with cornbread, and you can still buy it in the South. You probably couldn't buy it up north, but it's a thick, has a little aftertaste. It's a lot like molasses. Molasses is also a derivative of sugar, cane sugar, what we call processing. It's the brown sugar. Actually, brown sugar still has some of the molasses in it, which makes it a little bit moister, has a different flavor than white sugar. And white sugar has all the molasses stripped out of it, so it has a different taste. Raw sugar is, again, not bleached, still has a little bit of that brownish kind of tan color. A lot of people like the flavor of it, but it is just a browner kind of thicker sugar. Less refined is the word I'm going to use. Then we have coconut sugar. We used it in the lab. It turns things brown, has a lot of fiber. To me, it's not one of my favorites. We have agave. We have coconut nectar that you can buy as a liquid substitute. Agave, especially for vegans who do not do your honeys because it comes from an animal. Here's an agave syrup that you could use as a substitute for these. And then we have, this is, if you don't want to do a corn syrup, maybe you're making a pecan pie, and this is a pure cane sugar syrup that you could use as a substitute for corn syrup. Caro syrup is made with corn. We have maple syrup, which comes from a maple tree, which is up north. We don't have them down here in the south. It's a sap that comes from the tree. It's cooked down a little bit, comes in various colors, fairly expensive. One of these costs about $10. So asking somebody to purchase that for their pancakes on a very fixed income would probably not be appropriate. We also have xylitol, which is a sweetener used in a lot of your processed foods that are going to be low sugar, dental related. The bacteria in your gut or your mouth can't break this down and make tartar and cavities. So xylitol is also used. You can buy this now in the grocery store as a sugar substitute. And then I just want to mention a really fun sugar that I like if you're going to be baking and you want to make something fancy. It's called sparkling sugar. It's a sugar that's granulated into little chunks. It looks like snow. So if you were going to make a sugar cookie and you wanted them to look real fancy and you wanted to top them with that, you can find that in the Whole Foods section. This is a Red Mill, Bob's Red Mill. Most of your Krogers and stores will have that. It's just a really pretty. And if you're a baker, you want your stuff to be really, really pretty. It's like edible art when you're a baker. So these are some of the different sugar alternatives and being able to talk about them. I didn't even bring up honey, which is popular. There's a belief that if you eat honey, local honey, that you get some of the pollen, which the bees are collecting, and this is the food for their babies. And we are taking in some of that pollen and building some immunity to allergies. I like local honey just because we have a lot of beekeepers here in the Houston area, and I like to support them. And some of the honeys they have a name based on the kinds of trees or plants that the animals, the bees are collecting pollen from. And this one's an orange one, so they are in a citrus area where they're getting orange blossoms. Other ones, this is a wildflower. Sometimes you can taste the difference, sometimes you can't. So that's kind of just a variety of talking about different kinds of sweeteners. When using honey in a recipe, you're going to have to cut back on some of your liquids. Otherwise, the batter will be too wet and soupy. Okay, pies, I hope, are the new trendy food, and they're replacing cupcakes and bundt cakes. Pies are very easy to make. I know my grandmother was a farmer's wife, and she made pies every single day for dessert, for dinner, in the evening, because they are so easy, and it's a great way to use any fruits that you've maybe harvested and have a lot of. And you could be creative with pies too. I made this pumpkin pie today, and I used a pre-made crust, which I don't love, but in a bind, I'm all about the inside anyway, so I didn't really mind. And then I used some of the extra pie crust to make a leaf with a little leaf cutter, kind of decorated a little bit. You can also buy some fancy, here's one for an apple pie, and you just put it on some pie crust, the second crust maybe, and then you put little tiny apples off and lay them on top. And it's just kind of fun. Being careful that sometimes you have to overcook the crust. You can take tin foil and put it along the edge to keep it from cooking too quickly. Prick the bottom. That's when we're doing one that doesn't have a liquidy filling like this. Maybe a chocolate pudding pie. Prevent it from puffing up. We don't want that. Or we kind of prick it with a fork. Expand. So those are just, each pie is a little bit different. Some of them have meringue. Some of them you serve with a crumble top. Some of them, like apple pie, is actually served with cheddar cheese. It's a good complement to it. But when it comes to the crust, it's really important that you do the crust correctly. And there are some devices you need. Number one is this. Number two is a pie crust roller, which is a rolling pin. So let's just talk about it. So the recipe in the lab is 1 cup of flour, and it's 2 tablespoons, the best of the best. Lard is pork fat, so for religious reasons that don't consume pork. You can use Crisco, which is a vegetable base. But this is what a lot of women product, but by any means, is it heart healthy? The answer is no. Flakiness. So I got my 2 tablespoons. And why do we chill the fat? It's to keep it from getting soft and moist and making a creamy. We don't really want this creamy. We want each one of these little pieces of fat to break up. What this thing is doing is cutting the fat. This is what we call cutting the fat into the flour. I can use this pastry cutter, or I can take 2 knives and kind of crisscross them, breaking those little pieces of fat into small, maybe pea-sized pieces. And this is what's going to make a good flaky crust, and that's what we did in the lab. We made a really nice flaky crust out of this product. But your white shortenings like Crisco and like that would work just as well. We noticed that the oil-based ones did not work very well, made more like a cracker. So it's finally getting into small pieces. Keep cleaning my pastry cutter. I always laugh because my dad told me that my grandmother, who was not his mother, it was my mother's mother, a serving of pie was 1/4 of a pie, and she would make tons of pies, and everybody got 1/4 of a pie when she served them. She was really good at making pies. So now it's just kind of little pieces of shortening. Now this is when you add the ice water. Why ice water? Because you want the water to start developing, start melting the fat. So I'm just going to add it a little bit at a time, working it in. Why am I wearing gloves? Because there are oils in my hands that get into the mixture, and it makes it tough. So I wear gloves because I want a super flaky crust. Just working it in a little bit at a time. You just want it enough so that you can work it with your hands, and you need to be able to roll it out. So we're just going to keep adding. Using a spoon or something like that because I can feel the texture better, and I want it. See, right now it's a little too dry for me to roll it out. Keep adding my ice water a little bit at a time. Making anything with flour depends on the humidity in the air, and it's pretty humid. Different. I'm going to switch hands because I'm better with this other hand. There we go. I'm starting to get a ball that I can roll out. Collecting all that flour on the edge. Might need a little bit more. And I think we should be done with this. Don't want to overhandle it too much. Just enough to get it the texture I want. There we go. I like it. I like it. I'm going to make it into a ball. And you could refrigerate this if it was warm out and you wanted it to be a little bit. Hold on a minute. So when we have our dough, we make it into a circle, flatten it out as a disc. Got flour on both sides, flour my rolling pin. And then we want to move from the center to 12 o'clock, from the center to 6 o'clock, from the center to 3 to 9, and then do your diagonals, 11 to 5, 1 to 7, and you see how it stays a circle, always starting from the middle, moving out. Flour up if I need to. It's not a bad thing. Flour. And you get it as thin as you want. We're going to trim it anyway when we put it in the pie tin. I can see it's translucent. I can see through. And then we just use a flat spatula, very carefully rolling it in, laying it in the pan, working the edges.
These cupcakes were made with avocado oil, butter. They are vegan as well, and we use coconut sugar. It doesn't look like the other ones, but it tastes really good. I can qualify it by 5 with flavor and sweetness. Is a good dessert if you want a healthy option. Okay, this is a vegan version of the pie crust. It's really good. A little bit salty, but we can reduce the amount of salt when we are preparing it. And I can only make it with an apple filling. because it's really good.
These cupcakes were made with the regular white granulated sugar. These were the control for the other cupcakes. They turned out really good. The sweetness was about a 4, I would say. Not quite as sweet as like the Truvia and the Splenda. They had really good flavor and good texture. This is the pie crust that was made with the lard. It is the most flaky of all of the pie crusts. It's very tender as well, and it has good flavor, very rich flavor.
So this is the one made with Splenda, and it turned out really good. It almost, I cannot even tell if it's not sugar. It's a really good substitute for sugar. It's granulated. I think it turned out moist. It is really good. This is the crust that was made with olive oil, and it turned out a little bit tough. Its texture is more like the flat bread. It's not as flaky as the other ones, so I think this is the least flaky. But it's still really good. It's a little salty, but it tastes good.
So these cupcakes were made with Truvia, which is a stevia blend, and the cupcake, the taste of it at first is really good, but then there's a really bitter aftertaste. The cupcake didn't rise as good as the other ones, like the normal sugar, and it also has tunnels in there instead of the smaller holes. So yeah, overall it's probably medium. It could work, but not the best. So this pie crust was made using butter, and the taste was really good, buttery. The texture is really flaky. I would say butter is my preferred fat to use for a pie crust. It turned out really good.